everyone, and welcome. My name is Alexandra Papadopoulou from Sūtra House, and I'm just delighted to welcome you to the second episode of the Author Talks, bringing readers and authors together one conversation at a time. Last week, we explored a captivating literary mystery. Today, we're turning to something entirely different, a memoir that is honest, deeply moving, and profoundly human. It's a story written by someone whose work is inspiring not only on the page, but also through the meaningful impact of her professional calling. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Jessica Shannon, author of The Sum of Grief. Jessica, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Lovely to hear that. So let's dig in. Your book digs deep into personal experience and it is built entirely on it. So before we get into the book, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who is Jessica when she isn't working writing?
There are three things that could really define me easily, and that would be dogs, particularly Boston Terriers, horses, my equestrian sport of hunter jumper, and Arsenal Football Club out of London. Those would be the easiest things that uh, could easily define me. Maybe my ability to quote Seinfeld. As I once won a citywide Seinfeld quoting contest. But
Wow.
I spent the first 10 years of my life in Pittsburgh and then moved to Houston in 1991. And then I, grew up here, went to an international school. And then I did my undergrad at Sweetbriar College in Virginia. And then I did seminary in Austin, Texas at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. And then I did my CPE, clinical pastoral education, which is training to be a chaplain after you get your master's degree in the Houston, Texas Medical Center. But yeah, I mean, what defines Jessica's football, dogs, and horses?
I love that. Football, dogs, and horses. And we're going to get to horses also a little bit later, which is a
Yes, for
recurring, which is something very important from your book, and we will discuss that. But I would first like to ask you what it takes to write a memoir. This is such a specific genre, and we feel that we need to talk about it with such responsibility because it refers to something personal that the author has been through. So, can you tell us what it actually takes to write a memoir?
I think writing a memoir is very special. But writing fiction is too. I'm intimidated by it, even though I'm kind of intrigued and wonder if I can. But with writing a memoir, you have to give yourself permission to be vulnerable without it seeming like you're venting in a diary. And I think the CPE, which I mentioned before, the chaplain training after your master's, is really helped me tell my story with honesty, vulnerability, calmness, without using the book as a space to process it. So I have been processing my story openly for years. Whenever we don't process whatever our story is, or whatever that part of our life that we want to capture in the memoir, if we're not processing it in whatever way works for us, then we may really struggle using a memoir as a form of therapy. So if writing a memoir, both to heal you but to also heal others, is something that piques your interest, make sure that you've really processed that story a bit already. Particularly if it's traumatic, obviously if it's all a joyful thing, you probably don't need that, but you don't want it to look like a diary and just, you know, full like word vomit, venting. I I think I'm alone now. I think I'm alone now, and that's okay. I think as long as we're still going, then I'm okay. And I'll just talk about then a little bit about vulnerability. So I said that to write a memoir, you need to be vulnerable, and that's uh, well, the weird thing about that is that chaplains are trained not to be vulnerable and not to share our own story. We use our story to inform our questions and how we support people. But it can get to the point where you're almost suppressing your story. But to write my memoir, I had to say that it's okay to be vulnerable and to give myself permission to be human. There are so many times in my work where colleagues, especially, made it clear that they found it uncomfortable when I seemed human. Um, Sometimes you meet colleagues you kind of in the chaplain world where you kind of feel like you have that extra bond, and maybe I can be human. You know, we know not to be that way, to be vulnerable and human with our patients and families, but every once in a while you meet another colleague where you're like, I can do this. I can actually tell them how I feel today. But then they make it clear that, hey, perhaps you can't. So I had to get to a point in my life where I said, my story matters as much as the stories of that I've been carrying of other people's. We talk about being a chaplain as emotional labor, so we're always carrying other people's stories. And I finally had to say, my story matters too, and this is the special time where my story could perhaps heal others too. Um, and you have to really get to a point in your chaplain career when you're able to really assess that, to say that this is it's okay now. I can be human, and there's nothing wrong with that. And you know, and I wrote this book all through 2025, um, which it was the same year that I was turning the year my mother died, and that's the age I was turning the age she was when she died, which is a very weird number and milestone for grievers who, particularly when they lost a parent when they're really young. Um, and I was gonna theoretically outlive her, but for years, I didn't think that was gonna happen. Like many people in that situation, we can't see past that age. So I thought for sure, for years, I thought I was gonna die at age 44. And then specifically 44 years, 9 months, and 6 days. So I kind of decided that I had to grab that year and really embrace it, and not just be on the couch the whole year. And that's so I decided to write in that whole year, and it was really strange to kind of watch it unfold at the same time. And but I was kind of inspired. Years ago, I read a memoir of a woman who she rode horses when she was little, and then when she got older, became an adult, she decided to spend 1 year bringing horses back in her life. And I really loved that she focused on 1 year of her life. So I was kind of doing that in a way, um, focusing on 2025, the year I turned the same age my mom was when she died. But at the same time, um, I also needed to reflect. I couldn't do that exactly because it would look strange and not much of a book if I just focused on 1 year for when it came to the grief math. But I, so I just kind of sat back, you know, also realized I needed to reflect back on the previous 26 years in order to really talk about the grief math and why turning her age mattered, and how I navigated all of these years, um, while at the same time helping people in their grief too, which is not always the case. There are plenty of people who lost a parent when they were young, but they're not all also carrying other people's grief at the same time. So I was doing both, and that's sometimes uh, very freeing and connecting, without using your story. But at other times, it's like, okay, this is too much, and I need to breathe. You know. Um, so, and sometimes too, we think about when it came to writing it, people wondered, were there stories that I was afraid to include, or how did I decide what to include? Well, and I'll just answer that by saying that there weren't any I was afraid to include, but there were some that I chose to leave out. Um, hi. Nope. I'm just gonna keep talking. I have no problem talking. I get paid to listen, so whenever someone gives me a chance to talk, I'm really excited about it. um, yeah, until I, receive a note otherwise, I'm just gonna talk. Um, yeah. Um, there was one story that I left out, that initially I thought I told that story too many times, especially in the horse world, to people in the horse community. Um, that I was like, I've told this so many times. And it's not essential, it's essential to my grief story, but maybe not to the book. And then it was interesting after the final edits were submitted and the book, to Sūtra House, and we were done. In the middle of the night, I woke up in a panic that the story wasn't in there. And I was like, because it's just so important to me. And so I raced to my lap and I was like, well, of course it's in there. And I raced to my laptop and I searched and it wasn't in the book. And I thought, oh my gosh, how did I leave that out? And then, but this is, 3 o'clock in the morning panic. So which, what person in their 40s isn't waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning? But it wasn't in the book. And I had to remember why I left it out. And I guess the way to say is that I kept things that allowed my story to flow in a beautiful way while also making sure that each tidbit pointed back to grief math rather than simply being a story of my grief. There's no way I could include every thought, feeling, or conversation that centered on my own grief. I just had to make sure that the stories all fit with grief math. So when I did decide to eliminate that story, that's probably why, even though in the middle of the night I thought, oh my gosh, there's no way that's not in there. And it's not. I can tell it now if people want, but there's no comment section. Hi, Kay.
Hey, Jessica, how are you?
Good. I'm just moving along. I'm assuming it's working.
I know. Sorry, there was some technical difficulty. So anyway, so as you were talking about your experience going through, you know, I think what particularly I just want to take some steps back and go back into the grief math, right? That's a very interesting topic, and I think you've talked about it quite a bit in other, interviews and stuff. But maybe for general public, like, how you think you went about it. Maybe that would be interesting.
Yeah. So, well, grief math is something that I've never, and I've made this clear in the book, and anyone that went to school with me as a child is aware. I'm terrible at math, but and for someone who played piano and violin for so long, that's pretty crazy that I can't, that I'm terrible. But the one math that instantly clicked was grief math, and I didn't have a name for it for a long time. And then one time I named it, or so I thought, until I listened to a podcast with Anderson Cooper and Stephen Colbert, and they were talking about grief math. And I was like, I guess I can't trademark that, but it's a very common coping tool, particularly for people who lost someone when they were young. So like a child loses a sibling. Am I the only one that has that echo, or is it just no?
Yes, there is an echo.
Cool. Whatever. I'll just keep going. So yeah, when a child or adolescent loses, that's gone. Child or adolescent loses a parent. Grief math is something very common. You're sort of, counting to milestones. How many Christmases have they missed? How many of my birthdays? How many of their birthdays have they missed? And how many, like the first year, I was counting how many months. So on the 12th of every month, I was counting how many months it's been since she was gone. And you use that math to kind of make sense of your loss, and one of the many things in life that we have no control over is grief. And grief math gives you a little bit of comfort and a little bit of sense of control. And when I was thinking about writing this book, I wanted to make sure that it was as common as I thought. Given what I had experienced professionally and talking to other friends throughout the years who had lost parents, everyone had kind of hinted at it without naming it, right? And so I did do like a poll on a lot of my social media platforms saying, hey, if you lost a parent when you were young, can you send me a message? I have questions for you. And I had just a list of questions that all kind of were rooted in grief math. And men, women, they all answered the questions the same or similarly, that validated it. And then I also read some articles about that women wrote about outliving their mother and how that felt. And that's all part of the grief math.
Hi, Jessica. Sorry, I'm back. Unfortunately, yes, with technology, we have to expect the unexpected.
Hey, I just rolled with it. I just kept going.
Great. And thankfully, Kay was there to step in. Thank you.
Yes.
And I apologize. So you were discussing grief math, which is extremely important as a message that you want to convey with your book as well, and to teach people kind of what it means, what it represents. Can you just briefly mention a part of the book was written on the way to Ireland.
Yes.
You mentioned the Ireland trip as something extremely important, and the motivation actually for your book. Can you can you explain this importance, how it connects to your mother and Peggy, and the fact that you went alone in the end?
Yeah, so there were like three sort of foundational, inspirational things for the book. One was grief math. Two was turning the age that my mom was when she died. And the third was Ireland. And when I was, I don't know, 14, 15 years old, I'm just going to say 15, my paternal grandmother and paternal great aunt, so my dad's aunt and my dad's mother, both told me that they had always wanted to visit Ireland. And as tourists, everywhere they had not been as tourists. Either my grandmother was accompanying my grandfather on work trips, and because she had polio as a child, she never got to venture much, far from hotels. She couldn't really walk very well. And he worked so hard on these trips, he didn't like to do anything touristy. So the only thing she would get to do was, go out to eat at something at a restaurant close to the hotel while he was working. And my great aunt was married to a man in the CIA during the Cold War, and they lived in Eastern Europe and West Africa. And so she worked for the State Department too, just a different role. And so her adventures were secretive yet fun, I guess, maybe a little dangerous. But she was never a tourist either. And they were both intrigued by Ireland. And I told my mom, and she just lit up, and said, we're going on a girls' trip. We're going to take them, the two matriarchs of the family, and then you and I are going to ride horses one or two of the days. She's like, I know that, they can't be as active as we are anyway, so we're going to take some days to ride. And we never got to do the trip. So my mom died suddenly in 1998. My grandmother died in 2002. And then my great aunt, who I became increasingly closer to, she died at the beginning of COVID in 2020. So that trip never happened. And I kept dreaming about it and thinking about it. It just seemed like such a pipe dream. But as I approached turning the age my mom was when she died, I thought, you know what? No more obstacles. I am going to focus year 44 of my life on that trip. I'm going riding in Ireland. And it's already a very popular destination for equestrians. And so I thought, this will be perfect. I'm going to do it. I don't care if I have to take another, like a side job to pay for it, I'm going to do it. And so I did. And, and there were other horse friends that thought, oh my gosh, I want to come. And I kept thinking, no. This is a trip I need to do on my own, just in case there's any friend dynamics that pop up, or what if I just really need to sit in some emotions and they don't want to at the moment, and I don't want that to taint any part of the trip. So it was a solo trip, which honestly reignited my love for solo travel. It's really healing. But yeah, so I went and I rode. It was a 6-night, 5-day trip around the Ring of Kerry, and we rode horses into inn. Really beautiful.
It's an inspiring story, and it really teaches us that we always need to seize opportunities, right? Never wait for things that we wanted for so long. And it ended up being the inspiration for this book, this amazing book, which moves across 27 years but keeps returning to a single date. How did you find the shape of it?
Well, I started again with Grief, Math, in Ireland as that inspiration, and 2025 is the focus. I knew I had to make the whole story work, my story coming to life. If focusing on the year I thought I would die, because she did, I had to introduce the readers to Grief Math, but then I also needed to reflect on the past 26 years. So and that single day, it's the 12th of December is important, but then, and the anniversary of her death is important, which is the 12th, but also counting from which that was 9 months and 6 days from her 44th birthday, which wouldn't be the same for me. So I had to count that as well. From my birthday, I had to count 9 months and 6 days, but I had known that for years. I had this day looming of the day that I could die, and it was very strange the following day to wake up. And there's a chapter on that, just waking up the next day going, oh my gosh, I'm older than my mother.
Right. It's thrilling to think about this mindset and how this must have moved you. And this grief math that you explained to us, it's connected to numbers, of course. So we have these 27 years, and then we also have the number of 11, which is relevant because there were 11 days between your mother's diagnosis and her death, and you were in England for most of them. Yeah. So how did that compressed timeline shape the way you've told the story of her death ever since?
I have told the story of December 1 to December 12th so many times, it's impossible to count over the last 27 years, especially the first, I'd say, 5 years, because people would ask and I would tell the story almost verbatim every time, like sort of a poet, almost robotically, but still poetically, it would be touching, but I was telling it the exact same way every time. And every single time I told it, I healed a little bit. And so, because people say, oh, do you mind me asking? I'm like, no, I'm so glad you did. Because it's like I processed it every time I shared those 11 days. And there are many times, especially early on, where I was upset that I had gone on the trip, but I can't. I mean, part of telling the story is saying that she insisted I go. As we found out on the December 1st that she had the tumor, and I said, I'm not going. I was leaving for England on December 2nd. And she said, no, you're going. And, December 10th, I was flying back, and there was, and she was in neurosurgery while I was on British Airways coming back, and there was a passed out Welsh rugby player in the aisle that I had to walk on his back to go to the bathroom. But the whole time I'm thinking about that neurosurgery, and then 2 days later she was gone. But at the same time that I wish that, I'm, in some ways I'm so glad she pushed me to go on the trip, because it was a life-changing trip in many ways. But I'm also really glad because my parents were true high school sweethearts, and they got 11 days on their own, which I can't imagine, having two kids that, my brother was 20 at the time, almost 20, just a couple of days from turning 21. I can't imagine that they had 11 days to themselves in 21 years. Maybe a few days here and there, but I think that was probably really important for them, that they got that without knowing it.
Right. That's lovely to hear. Such a romantic notion, even in such difficult times. And you mentioned processing, and in situations like this in life, processing is so important, which brings us to the fact that there was a chaplain in the room the night your mother died, and he never reached you. And you are a chaplain. So what did that night teach you about the work you'd go on to do?
I learned to do the opposite of, speaking of Seinfeld, there's a whole episode where George does the opposite of what his instincts are. And that's what he taught me to do, this chaplain. I was 17 years old. A 17-year-old is fully capable of understanding any job, any career, any vocation. And if they don't know and they ask, you can tell them and they're going to say, okay, thank you, and so this man, a stranger, appears right not long after the doctor told my dad that my mom died, and he pulled up next to my dad, and I couldn't get next to my dad. And I asked who he was, what he did, and he couldn't tell me. And, if you think about it, anybody that was in that room, the two most important people in that room were my dad and I, and he couldn't tell, one of us why he was there. And so when I ended up, and I had never heard of a chaplain before, ever. And I still, I've been doing this job for, almost 20 years, give or take. And I meet people all the time of all ages that have no idea what a chaplain does, or their experience is limited, only military or only this, and he couldn't even take that to say, like, maybe you've heard of a military chaplain, and here's how it works in the hospital, something like that. He couldn't do that. So I instantly, when I went into chaplaincy in 2007, so 9 years after she died, I made it like the first week. I decided right then and there that I was always going to make sure the lowest developmental person, which is not always the youngest person, that every understood why I was there. I wanted to make sure everybody in the room, could come up with multiple elevator speeches or whatever I needed, but I wanted everyone in the room to know who I was, what a chaplain is, and how a chaplain's going to help them in their scenario, them specifically. I always, I would know what their diagnosis was, or why they were there. And I needed to give them specific reasons of how I was going to be supportive to them, and how I work with the whole team. That, I'm not siloed from the doctors and the nurses or the social workers. We all work together. And so I always made sure everybody knew, because one guy at the worst moment of my life couldn't tell me why he was there. So I make sure that when I'm at the worst moments of people's lives, that they know why I'm there.
Right. And we truly never know in which moments in life we will have the biggest realizations, like you did at that moment. And usually it's actually in the hardest moments, right, that we have the biggest realizations. So now if we shift to your experience as a chaplain, and one of your interventions is actually bibliotherapy. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
So, there are a lot of different people in the psychosocial disciplines. That would be chaplain, child life specialist, social work, therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, that use what's called bibliotherapy as an intervention tool. But we all use it differently. And I spent most of my career, and am most passionate about being a pediatric chaplain, which means that children are at the center of my care. And I'm not doing that now, but that's been the most of my career. And the way I use bibliotherapy is in the closet to my left, I have about 40, 50 children's books in there, and they're all about feelings, death, dying, grief, diseases, and different things like that. And I sit with children and I read with them, and I use specific wondering statements to help them process their feelings, or come to terms with what is going on with them. There was one kid that I wrote a case study about, that he was an 11-year-old terminal cancer patient. And over a series of visits, I used almost 24 children's books that helped me build trust with him, because he thought I was a stranger, I was a stranger to him at first. So the books first were casual, just building bonding time, because reading together, any parent will tell you that reading with a child, or aunt, uncle will tell you reading with a child is a very magical bonding experience. And so they first built rapport, and then it held space for him to name his emotions. And eventually I just kept assessing what was next and where he was going. And I would choose books at the beginning, I let him pick out of my bag, but they were still kind of intentionally chosen. And then I had less and less options for him, and they were more about dying, and for him to eventually tell me that he was dying. And there was one book in particular that I've used it with adults, children with multiple diseases. It's called The Rabbit Listened. And the point of the rabbit is so there's this boy named, he's the star of the book. He's his name's Taylor, and he builds a castle with blocks. And one day the blocks just come tumbling down, and all these different animals come and visit Taylor. And they, like, the chicken wants him to talk about it, the elephant wants him to remember, the hyena wants him to laugh. They're all projecting how he should cope with this big situation in his life. And he doesn't want to do any of those things in that moment. So he just keeps going and is sitting there, and everyone who projects how he should cope, when he doesn't want to cope that way, they leave him. But then the rabbit appears and just sits next to him and listens, doesn't say a word, and lets him be angry, lets him cry, lets him laugh, lets him reminisce, lets Taylor go about things in his own time, and the rabbit simply listens. And that's the goal of a chaplain, is to listen. And it should be the goal of all of us. And so I've really had some incredible visits out of using bibliotherapy. And it's an assessment tool as well as an intervention tool. So it really allows, and with adults, I use music lyrics. There's just so many great songs about grief and heartbreak and things that we can look at the lyrics as a poem, or use actual poems. But sometimes, songwriting really helps, because we could play the song with it, and the music might open up some tear ducts, and so you can use it that way too. It's really beautiful. You're using the written word to help people, articulate their feelings and tell their story.
That's beautiful. So from your point of view, it says we are running out of time as well. At the same time, I just want to make sure that we actually extract the message which anyone who's reading your book would be able to, take it forward as either as a gift, or, from my point of view, I see it as a celebration of life, the time you spent with that person who's not there anymore. But at the same time, we always remember, right? We never forget. And the pain never goes away because it's there.
Yeah.
Right. So how and what message anyone should take out from the book, reading it? I've for myself, I have done that. But at the same time, what do you think? What is the message?
Well, I hope that it does a couple of things. That whether you yourself have had a profound loss and you read it, or you are close friends or family with somebody who has, that I hope that it shows you that grief doesn't have a timeline and it doesn't end. There's a thing that people think about called prolonged grief, and prolonged grief is not the same. Prolonged grief is when grief gets in the way of you doing functioning regular things in life. But normal grief, with such a profound loss as losing a parent or a sibling when you're young, or really anytime, it is that the grief really does come, it ebbs and flows, and it shifts with you, and you grow with it, and it's always with you. It always sits with you. And I think that that's really important. And I hope that when people read this, that they say, you know what, I'm not alone. I'm not weird, that I'm still sad some days, or that I want to talk about her, or I want to talk about him. I want to talk about my dog. I want to talk about, who died. And I want to talk about my mom. And I don't want people to look at me funny. Sometimes people will tell a story about their parent, and their parent's alive, and everyone at the table, is laughing. Oh, great. But then I will tell a story that sounds very similar. It's just sort of picking back off their story, and it goes dead quiet, because I just mentioned a dead person. But it's the same story, and you should be able to talk about that person or that dog or horse or anybody that you've lost. It's so important. And I'm really hoping that reading such a vulnerable but honest story, and my memoir tells people, hey, you know what? It is okay that I still miss them. It is okay that on the anniversary of their death, I always go to their favorite restaurant. It is okay that I ignore the death of their anniversary, but always celebrate their birthday. And it is okay that I miss them, and it is okay that I talk about them, and that I want to talk about them more.
Yeah. No, I think that's really a profound, touching message, and we should definitely look at grief a little bit differently. I know some times you cannot. But I hope this memoir of yours, which is almost a point where you have personally laid out your own experience and how you dealt with it and everything else. So I hope people get some learning out of it, and as well as, experience that journey. Thank you so much, Jessica, for your time today. And I apologize to the viewers as well as to you for having this difficulty in going back and forth. But hopefully, everyone enjoyed the conversation.
Oh
And,
yeah.
and I hope you enjoyed talking about a lot of things that you have done with the book. And also, we're looking forward to having you talk about specific topics, hopefully in the future,
Yeah.
and maybe have a separate session on certain things which your book talks about.
Yeah, absolutely. And rolling with the punches is easy when you've been working in hospitals. You never know what's going to happen. So tech difficulties, that's nothing. So
Okay,
it's
I appreciate
it's
it.
no problem at all. And I just want to encourage everybody to you know grab the privilege that it is to age. I think we forget that sometimes, and to honor the people that you lost always.
Yep. Thank you, Jessica. And The Sum of Grief is available on Amazon and wherever the books are sold, or in your local bookstore. So thank you, Jessica. Have a wonderful day. And
Thanks,
rest of the
everybody.
best. Thank you.